false flag describes covert military or paramilitary operations designed to deceive in such a way that the operations appear as though they are being carried out by entities, groups or nations other than those who actually planned and executed them. Operations carried out during peacetime by civilian organizations, as well as covert government agencies, may by extension be called false flag operations if they seek to hide the real organization behind an operation. Geraint Hughes uses the term to refer to those acts carried out by military or security force personnel, which are then blamed on terrorists. In its most modern usage, the term may also refer to those events which governments are cognizant of and able to stop but choose to allow to happen, as a strategy to entangle or prepare the nation for war. Furthermore, the term false flag terrorism may even be used in those instances when violence is carried out by groups or organizations which, whether they know it or not, are being supported or controlled by the victim nation. deHaven-Smith argues that the terminology has become looser in recent years due to the increasingly complex levels of duplicity and international intrigue between states. Some argue that false flags are methods used by deep states as a form of deep politics. The name false flag has its origins in naval warfare where the use of a flag other than the belligerent's true battle flag as a ruse de guerre, before engaging the enemy, has long been acceptable. Such operations are also acceptable in certain circumstances in land warfare, to deceive enemies in similar ways providing that the deception is not perfidious and all such deceptions are discarded before opening fire upon the enemy. Use in warfare, naval warfare. This practice is considered acceptable in naval warfare, provided the false flag is lowered and the true flag raised before engaging in battle. Auxiliary cruisers operated in such a fashion in both world wars, as did Q ships, while merchant vessels were encouraged to use false flags for protection. The 1914 Battle of Trinidad was between the auxiliary cruisers RMS Carmania and SMS Cap Trafalgar, in which Cap Trafalgar had been altered to look like Carmania. One of the most notable examples was in World War II when the German commerce raider Cormoran, disguised as a Dutch merchant ship, surprised and sank the Australian light cruiser HMAS Sydney in 1941, causing the greatest recorded loss of life on an Australian warship. Cormoran was also fatally damaged in that encounter and its crew was captured, but it was a considerable psychological victory for the Germans. The British used a Kriegsmarine ensign in the St. Nazaire raid and captured a German code book. The old destroyer Campbelltown, which the British planned to sacrifice in the operation, was provided with cosmetic modifications, cutting the ship's funnels and chamfering the edges to resemble a German Mar-Paragraph-class torpedo boat. The British were able to get within 2 miles of the harbour before the defences responded, where the explosive-rigged Campbelltown and commandos successfully disabled or destroyed the key dock structures of the port. Air warfare. In December 1922 February 1923, rules concerning the control of wireless telegraphy in time of war and air warfare, drafted by a commission of jurists at The Hague regulates, Art. 3. A military aircraft must carry an exterior mark indicating its nationality and its military character. Art. 19. The use of false exterior marks is forbidden. This draft was never adopted as a legally binding treaty, but the ICRC states in its introduction on the draft that to a great extent, the draft rules correspond to the customary rules and general principles underlying treaties on the law of war on land and at sea, and as such these two non-controversial articles were already part of customary law. Land warfare. In land warfare, the use of a false flag is similar to that of naval warfare. The most widespread assumption is that this practice was first established under international humanitarian law at the trial in 1947 of the planner and commander of Operation Grief, Otis Scoresny, by a U.S. military tribunal at the Dachau trials. In this trial, the tribunal did not find Scoresny guilty of a crime by ordering his men into action in American uniforms. He had passed on to his men the warning of German legal experts, that if they fought in American uniforms, they would be breaking the laws of war, but they probably were not doing so just by wearing American uniforms. During the trial, a number of arguments were advanced to substantiate this position and the German and U.S. militaries seem to have been in agreement on it. In the transcript of the trial, it is mentioned that paragraph 43 of the field manual published by the War Department, United States Army, on October 1, 1940, under the title Rules of Land Warfare, says, "National flags, insignias and uniforms as a ruse. In practice it has been authorized to make use of these as a ruse. The foregoing rule does not prohibit such use, but does prohibit their improper use. It is certainly forbidden to make use of them during a combat. Before opening fire upon the enemy, they must be discarded." Also, the American Soldier's Handbook was quoted by Defense Counsel and says, "The use of the enemy flag, insignia, and uniform is permitted under some circumstances. They are not to be used during actual fighting, and if used in order to approach the enemy without drawing fire, should be thrown away or removed as soon as fighting begins." The outcome of the trial has been codified in the 1977 Protocol additional to the Geneva Conventions of August 12, 1949, Article 37. A Prohibition of perfidy. 1. It is prohibited to kill, injure, or capture an adversary by resort to perfidy. Acts inviting the confidence of an adversary to lead him to believe that he is entitled to, or is obliged to accord, protection under the rules of international law applicable in armed conflict, with intent to betray that confidence, shall constitute perfidy. The following acts are examples of perfidy: a. The feigning of an intent to negotiate under a flag of truce or of a surrender. b. The feigning of an incapacitation by wounds or sickness. c. The feigning of civilian, non-combatant status. And d. The feigning of protected status by the use of signs, emblems or uniforms of the United Nations or of neutral or other states not parties to the conflict. 2. Ruses of war are not prohibited. Such ruses are acts which are intended to mislead an adversary or to induce him to act recklessly but which infringe no rule of international law applicable in armed conflict and which are not perfidious because they do not invite the confidence of an adversary with respect to protection under that law. The following are examples of such ruses: the use of camouflage, decoys, mock operations and disinformation. Article 38. Recognize emblems. 1. It is prohibited to make improper use of the distinctive emblem of the Red Cross, Red Crescent or Red Lion and Sun or of other emblems, signs or signals provided for by the conventions or by this protocol. It is also prohibited to misuse deliberately in an armed conflict other internationally recognized protective emblems, signs or signals, including the flag of truce, and the protective emblem of cultural property. 2. It is prohibited to make use of the distinctive emblem of the United Nations, except as authorized by that organization. Article 39. Emblems of nationality. 1. It is prohibited to make use in an armed conflict of the flags or military emblems, insignia or uniforms of neutral or other states not parties to the conflict. 2. It is prohibited to make use of the flags or military emblems, insignia or uniforms of adverse parties while engaging in attacks or in order to shield, favor, protect or impede military operations. 3. Nothing in this article or in Article 37, paragraph 1, shall affect the existing generally recognized rules of international law applicable to espionage or to the use of flags in the conduct of armed conflict at sea. As pretexts for war, Russo-Swedish War, in 1788, the head tailor at the Royal Swedish Opera received an order to sew a number of Russian military uniforms. These were then used by Swedes to stage an attack on Pohjanmaa, a Swedish outpost on the Russo-Swedish border, on June 27, 1788. This caused an outrage in Stockholm and impressed the Riksdag of the Estates, the Swedish National Assembly, who until then had refused to agree to an offensive war against Russia. The Pohjanmaa incident allowed King Gustav III of Sweden, who lacked the constitutional authority to initiate unprovoked hostilities without the estate's consent, to launch the Russo-Swedish War, Second Sino-Japanese War. In September 1931, Japanese officers fabricated a pretext for invading Manchuria by blowing up a section of railway. Though the explosion was too weak to disrupt operations on the rail line, the Japanese nevertheless used this Mukden incident to seize Manchuria and create a puppet government for what they termed the independent state of Manchukuo. In 1937, in the Marco Polo Bridge incident, they based their invasion of China proper on the false claim that one of their soldiers had been kidnapped, initiating the Second Sino-Japanese War. World War II, Gleiwitz Incident. The Gleiwitz incident in 1939 involved Reinhard Heydrich fabricating evidence of a Polish attack against Germany to mobilize German public opinion for war and to justify the war with Poland. Alfred Norjoks was a key organizer of the operation under orders from Heydrich. It led to the deaths of innocent Nazi concentration camp victims who were dressed as German soldiers and then shot by the Gestapo to make it seem that they had been shot by Polish soldiers. This, along with other false flag operations in Operation Himmler, would be used to mobilize support from the German population for the start of World War II in Europe. The operation failed to convince international public opinion of the German claims, and both Britain and France Poland's allies declared war 2 days after Germany invaded Poland. Winter War. On November 26, 1939, the Soviet army shelled Mainila, a Russian village near the Finnish border. Soviet authorities blamed Finland for the attack and used the incident as a pretext to invade Finland, starting the Winter War. 4 days later. Cold War, Operation Northwoods. The planned, but never executed, 1962 Operation Northwoods plot by the U.S. Department of Defense for a war with Cuba involved scenarios such as fabricating the hijacking or shooting down of passenger and military planes, sinking a U.S. ship in the vicinity of Cuba, burning crops, sinking a boat filled with Cuban refugees, attacks by alleged Cuban infiltrators inside the United States, and harassment of U.S. aircraft and shipping and the destruction of aerial drones by aircraft disguised as Cuban MiGs. These actions would be blamed on Cuba, and would be a pretext for an invasion of Cuba and the overthrow of Fidel Castro's communist government. It was authored by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but then rejected by President John F. Kennedy. The surprise discovery of the documents relating to Operation Northwoods was a result of the comprehensive search for records related to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy by the Assassination Records Review Board in the mid-1990s. Information about Operation Northwoods was later publicized by James Bamford. As a tactic to undermine political opponents, Reichstag fire. The Reichstag fire was an arson attack on the Reichstag building in Berlin on February 27, 1933. The fire started in the session chamber, and, by the time the police and firemen arrived, the main chamber of deputies was engulfed in flames. Police searched the building and found Marinus van der Lubbe, a young, Dutch council communist and unemployed bricklayer who had recently arrived in Germany, to carry out political activities. The fire was used as evidence by the Nazis that the Communists were beginning a plot against the German government. Van der Lubbe and 4 communist leaders were subsequently arrested. Adolf Hitler, who was sworn in as Chancellor of Germany 4 weeks before, on January 30, urged President Paul von Hindenburg to pass an emergency decree to counter the ruthless confrontation of the Communist Party of Germany. With civil liberties suspended, the government instituted mass arrests of communists, including all of the communist parliamentary delegates. With their bitter rival communists gone and their seats empty, the National Socialist German Workers' Party went from being a plurality party to the majority. Subsequent elections confirmed this position and thus allowed Hitler to consolidate his power. Historians disagree as to whether van der Lubbe acted alone, as he said, to protest the condition of the German working class, or whether the arson was planned and ordered by the Nazis, then dominant in the government themselves, as a false flag operation. Project TP Ajax. On April 4, 1953, the CIA was ordered to undermine the government of Iran over a 4-month period, as a precursor to overthrowing Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. One tactic used to undermine Mossadegh was to carry out false flag attacks on mosques and key public figures, to be blamed on Iranian communists loyal to the government. The CIA project was codenamed TP Ajax, and the tactic of a directed campaign of bombings by Iranians posing as members of the Communist Party, involved the bombing of at least one well-known Muslim's house by CIA agents posing as communists. the CIA determined that the tactic of false flag attacks added to the positive outcome of Project TPAJAX. However, as CIA burned nearly all of its files on its role in the 1953 coup in Iran, the true extent of the tactic has been difficult for historians to discern. 2008 Kerch incident. In 2008 there was a shooting against two minibuses driving along in a volatile area right on the border between Abkhazia and the Republic of Georgia. The buses were carrying Georgians who lived in Abkhazia and wanted to cross the border so they could go and vote in the parliamentary election that day. The country had been experiencing internal political turmoil for the last year, and in an attempt to calm the situation, President Mikhail Saakashvili moved forward both presidential and parliamentary elections. However, the presidential election in January that year was strongly contested, with hundreds of thousands attending protest rallies. When the parliamentary election came up in May, the mood was still tense. On midday May 21 the two minibuses came under attack with small arms and grenades, and though there were no casualties, 3 people were taken to a hospital in Zugdidi, where President Saakashvili later arrived and was filmed by TV at the patient's bedside. In his comments on TV, which dominated the news during Election Day, Saakashvili indicated that the attack had been an attempt to disrupt the election, implying that it had been Abkhaz or Russian forces who had been behind it. This provided for a favorable opportunity for the president to focus the nation's attention on an external enemy, thereby leading attention away from his domestic critics, as well as making use of his position as leader to rally the Georgians around his candidates in the election. An investigation by the United Nations Observer Mission in Georgia found that the attackers were located on the Georgian side of the ceasefire line, about 100 m from the buses, and that although hard evidence of the attackers' identities was lacking, inconsistencies merited further investigation, particularly the suggestion that the filming of the attack seemed anticipatory. A Georgian investigative TV documentary later found that camera crew from the government-friendly channel Rustavi 2 had been in position with their equipment before the shooting took place. Pseudo-operations. Pseudo-operations are those in which forces of one power disguise themselves as enemy forces. For example, a state power may disguise teams of operatives as insurgents and, with the aid of defectors, infiltrate insurgent areas. The aim of such pseudo-operations may be to gather short or long-term intelligence or to engage in active operations, in particular assassinations of important enemies. However, they usually involve both, as the risks of exposure rapidly increase with time and intelligence gathering eventually leads to violent confrontation. Pseudo-operations may be directed by military or police forces, or both. Police forces are usually best suited to intelligence tasks. However, military provide the structure needed to back up such pseudo-ops with military response forces. According to U.S. military expert Lawrence Klein, the teams typically have been controlled by police services, but this largely was due to the weaknesses in the respective military intelligence systems. The State Political Directorate of the Soviet Union set up such an operation from 1921 to 1926. During Operation Trust, they used loose networks of White Army supporters and extended them, creating the pseudo-monarchist Union of Central Russia in order to help the OGPU identify real monarchists and anti-Bolsheviks. An example of a successful assassination was United States Marine Sergeant Herman H. Anikin leading a patrol of his Haitian gendarmerie disguised as enemy guerrillas in 1919. The patrol successfully passed several enemy checkpoints in order to assassinate the guerrilla leader Charlemagne Parr copyright rolled near Grande Riviere du Nord. Anikin was awarded the Medal of Honor and was commissioned a second lieutenant for his deed. During the Mau Mau uprising in the 1950s, captured Mau Mau members who switched sides and specially trained British troops initiated the pseudo-gang concept to successfully counter Mau Mau. In 1960 Frank Kitson published Gangs and Counter-Gangs, an account of his experiences with the technique in Kenya. Information included how to counter gangs and measures of deception, including the use of defectors, which brought the issue a wider audience. Another example of combined police and military oversight of pseudo-operations include the Sealer Scouts in the former country Rhodesia, governed by white minority rule until 1980. The Seal Scouts were formed at the beginning of Operation Hurricane, in November 1973, by Major Ronald Reed Daly. As with all special forces in Rhodesia, by 1977 they were controlled by COMOPS Commander Lieutenant General Peter Walls. The Seal Scouts were originally composed of 120 members, with all officers being white and the highest rank initially available for black soldiers being Color Sergeant. They succeeded in turning approximately 800 insurgents who were then paid by Special Branch, ultimately reaching the number of 1,500 members. Engaging mainly in long-range reconnaissance and surveillance missions, they increasingly turned to offensive actions, including the attempted assassination of Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army leader Joshua Nkomo in Zambia. This mission was finally aborted by the Seal Scouts, and attempted again, unsuccessfully, by the Rhodesian Special Air Service. Some offensive operations attracted international condemnation, in particular the Seal Scouts' raid on a Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army camp at Nyadzonyaphangwe, Mozambique in August 1976. ZANLA was then led by Josiah Tongogra. Using Rhodesian trucks and armored cars disguised as Mozambique military vehicles, 84 scouts killed 1,284 people in the camp. The camp was registered as a refugee camp by the United Nations. Even according to Reed Daly, most of those killed were unarmed guerrillas standing in formation for a parade. The camp hospital was also set ablaze by the rounds fired by the scouts, killing all patients. According to David Martin and Phyllis Johnson, who visited the camp shortly before the raid, it was only a refugee camp that did not host any guerrillas. It was staged for UN approval. According to a 1978 study by the Directorate of Military Intelligence, 68% of all insurgent deaths inside Rhodesia could be attributed to the Seal Scouts, who were disbanded in 1980. If the action is a police action, then these tactics would fall within the laws of the state initiating the pseudo, but if such actions are taken in a civil war or during a belligerent military occupation, then those who participate in such actions would not be privileged belligerents. The principle of plausible deniability is usually applied for pseudo-teams. Some false flag operations have been described by Lawrence E. Klein, a retired U.S. Army intelligence officer, as pseudo-operations, or the use of organized teams which are disguised as guerrilla groups for long or short-term penetration of insurgent-controlled areas. Pseudo-operations should be distinguished, notes Klein, from the more common police or intelligence infiltration of guerrilla or criminal organizations. In the latter case, infiltration is normally done by individuals. Pseudo-teams, on the other hand, are formed as needed from organized units, usually military or paramilitary. The use of pseudo-teams has been a hallmark of a number of foreign counterinsurgency campaigns. The Basra prison incident is a recent example of the use of false flag undercover operations in modern military operations. On September 19, 2005, 2 agents from the British Special Air Service opened fire on Iraqi soldiers disguised as members of a local terrorist group. According to witnesses, they weren't able to escape the area because the local authorities had enforced military checkpoints throughout the city. The SAS and U.S. Army had to deploy combat helicopters and a dozen armored vehicles in order to break into the jail and force the Iraqi authorities to hand over their agents before they could reveal any classified information. Espionage. In espionage, the term false flag describes the recruiting of agents by operatives posing as representatives of a cause the prospective agents are sympathetic to, or even the agent's own government. For example, during the Cold War, several female West German civil servants were tricked into stealing classified documents by agents of the East German Stasi intelligence service, pretending to be members of West German peace advocacy groups. The technique can also be used to expose enemy agents in one's own service, by having someone approach the suspect and pose as an agent of the enemy. Earl Edwin Pitts, a 13-year veteran of the U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation and an attorney, was caught when he was approached by FBI agents posing as Russian agents. British intelligence officials in World War II allowed double agents to firebomb a power station and a food dump in the UK to protect their cover, according to declassified documents. The documents stated the agents took precautions to ensure they did not cause serious damage. One of the documents released also stated, "It should be recognized that friends as well as enemies must be completely deceived." Civilian usage. While false flag operations originate in warfare and government, they also can occur in civilian settings among certain factions, such as businesses, special interest groups, religions, political ideologies and campaigns for office. Businesses. In business and marketing, similar operations are being employed in some public relations campaigns. Telemarketing firms practice false flag type behavior when they pretend to be a market research firm. In some rare cases, members of an unsuccessful business will destroy some of their own property to conceal an unrelated crime but make it appear as though the destruction was done by a rival company. Political campaigning. Political campaigning has a long history of this tactic in various forms, including in person, print media and electronically in recent years. This can involve when supporters of one candidate pose as supporters of another, or act as a straw man for their preferred candidate to debate against. This can happen with or without the candidate's knowledge. The Canuck letter is an example of one candidate creating a false document and attributing it as coming from another candidate in order to discredit that candidate. In the final days of the 1994 campaign, Governor Lawton Chiles ran a false flag operation that paid for tens of thousands of calls to elderly voters using false organization names. The calls purported to be from Republican groups and told voters that Jeb Bush was against Social Security and seniors. Chiles denied his campaign was behind the calls. After winning re-election and facing an investigation, Chiles admitted the truth in November 1995. In 2006, individuals practicing false flag behavior were discovered and outed in New Hampshire and New Jersey after blog comments claiming to be from supporters of a political candidate were traced to the IP address of paid staffers for that candidate's opponent. On February 19, 2011, Indiana Deputy Prosecutor Carlos Lamb sent a private email to Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker suggesting that he run a false flag operation to counter the protests against Walker's proposed restrictions on public employees' collective bargaining rights. If you could employ an associate who pretends to be sympathetic to the union's cause to physically attack you, who could discredit the unions, read the email. It went on to say that the effort would assist in undercutting any support that the media may be creating in favor of the unions. The press had acquired a court order to access all of Walker's emails and Lamb's email was exposed. At first, Lamb vehemently denied it, but eventually admitted it and resigned. Ideological. Proponents of political or religious ideologies will sometimes use false flag tactics. This can be done to discredit or implicate rival groups, create the appearance of enemies when none exist, or create the illusion of organized and directed opposition when in truth, the ideology is simply unpopular with society. In retaliation for writing The Scandal of Scientology, the Church of Scientology stole stationery from author Paulette Cooper's home and then used that stationery to forge bond threats and have them mailed to a Scientology office. The Guardian's office also had a plan for further operations to discredit Cooper known as Operation Freakout, but several Scientology operatives were arrested in a separate investigation and the plan failed. Terrorism. False flag tactics were also employed during the Algerian Civil War, starting in the middle of 1994. Death squads composed of DAR Copyright Department du Renseignement et de l'Azar Copyright Curator Copyright Security Forces disguised themselves as Islamist terrorists and committed false flag terror attacks. Such groups included the Organization of Young Free Algerians or the Secret Organization for the Safeguard of the Algerian Republic. According to Roger Falligot and Pascal Crop, the OJAL was reminiscent of the Organization of the French Algerian Resistance, a group of counter-terrorists created in December 1956 by the Direction de la Surveillance du Territoire, whose mission was to carry out terrorist attacks with the aim of quashing any hopes of political compromise. The Russian apartment bombings in the Russian cities of Bunyansk, Moscow, and Volgodonsk in September 1999, which killed nearly 300 people, was described by Yuri Felshtinsky, Alexander Litvinenko, David Satter, Boris Kajalitsky, Vladimir Pribilovsky, Anna Politkovskaya, filmmaker Andrei Nekrasov, Investigator Mikhail Trepashkin, Russian politician Alexander Lebed is a false flag terrorist attack coordinated by the Federal Security Service, the main domestic security agency of the Russian Federation. See also, concepts, agent provocateur, black propaganda, casus belli, cover operation, denial and deception, front organization, Joe Job, a similar online concept, mimicry, state terrorism. Examples: 1950–51 Baghdad bombings where Israeli agents targeted the Baghdad Jewish community, Lord, Bodum, Eren Traw, Canuck Letter, Cell Hole, CIA Operation Ajax, Gleiwitz incident also known as Operation Himmler, Lavin affair Israeli attempt to plant bombs in Western targets in Egypt, in blaming Arab elements, Marxist-Leninist Party of the Netherlands, Mossad Action and Defense Movement, Operation Gladio, Notes and References. Bibliography, deHaven-Smith, Lance. Conspiracy Theory in America, Austin, University of Texas Press.